highest GDP per capita in the Milky Way.
Small modular reactors under every village green.
This is Anglo-futurism.
You are tuning in once again to a broadcast from the King Charles III space station. I'm Tom O.
And I'm Callum Drysdale. And you, our listeners, have been sending us bucket loads of concerned letters. You saw the glorious apparition of the Northern Lights over the British Isles, and you wondered, how is the King Charles III space station holding up against the cosmic barrage of a geomagnetic storm?
For 2 nights, the KC-3 was lashed and buffeted. But for 2 nights, the thatch held firm. Our friends at the International Space Station briefly lost control of their heating unit, but we invited them round to warm themselves up by our fire.
It was a lock-in to remember. Those cosmonauts can certainly put it away. And Tom, I had no idea you had such a talent for Russian folk dancing.
You don't know me at all, but I do concede it's definitely easier in microgravity. Listeners, we've just finished our big greasy breakfast of lab-grown eggs and bacon. There are cigarette butts still floating in the pint glasses strewn around the station.
Yet there is no time to clean up because our second guest has just emerged from the airlock, and he is, for our money, the UK's finest space blogger.
On his excellent Substack, Planetocracy, Peter Hague writes about the ongoing revolution in space travel, covering topics such as Mars colonization, the next generation of space stations, and the tumbling cost of getting mass into orbit. Peter not only tells readers what's going on in space, but what should be going on.
Yes, Peter is spearheading the campaign for Britain to have a spaceport large enough to accommodate launches of Starship, which is SpaceX's biggest launch vehicle, and perhaps even humanity's ticket to Mars.
Peter, you more than anyone deserve your visit to the King Charles III space station. Welcome.
Hello there.
So, Peter, tell us a bit about yourself. What's your background and what led you to start writing about space?
Well, my background is in physics. I did my physics undergrad and a PhD in astrophysics at the University of Leicester. I'd had some interest in space travel, but my career at that time was geared towards astronomy. I had, during my undergrad, been part of a CubeSat project, which unfortunately never got to fly in space, but I was going on the normal astronomy career path. Apart from that, I did a postdoc at Durham briefly and then one at the Cavendish Lab in Cambridge. And during that time, I'd become aware of the progress SpaceX was making in making rockets reusable. And specifically, the turning point for me was seeing them successfully land the first stage of a Falcon 9 for the first time in December 2015.
Right, and so once that it was demonstrated that this was possible, you moved from a looking to a potentially a touching attitude.
Well, I came to the position that I had this background in physics, and I was thinking, like, what can I sort of do here? Because this was very interesting to me. So I applied this sort of physics lens to it. And towards the end of my last postdoc, I started working on a paper, which was the key constraint of putting things into orbit is mass. You're very mass constrained. And before SpaceX turned up, it was about $10,000 per kilogram to send stuff up. And they were getting the cost down rapidly. And I realised that this is going to be the metric which is going to drive the future of humanity in space.
And this is what you call the mass problem, right? Tell us more about that.
Well, it started off that we were incapable of putting anything into space. And then Sputnik happens, and we can start putting a certain amount into space. And the reason the Soviets took the lead early in the space race was because their rockets were bigger and could put a lot more into space from 1957 till about 1963, when the Americans debuted the Saturn I. So just by measuring how much mass each side could put into space over that period, you could show who was winning the space race. And also, later in the space race, you can see that the Americans won the moon race in large part because in 1969, their Saturn V rocket could put about 45 tons onto a translunar injection trajectory towards the moon.
So you're saying in this case, bigger is better. Bigger is basically everything.
I mean, there were other factors. I mean, it was over-determined why the Soviets lost the moon race. There's a bunch of tricks during the Gemini program that the Americans mastered that the Soviets were still rusty on in 1969. But fundamentally, they had a rocket which could send 45 tons to the moon, and the biggest functional Soviet rocket at the time could send less than 5.
Right.
So they could send a few probes, some rovers, some sample return, but the Americans with a much bigger rocket were able to send people.
So it's a question of oomph.
Well, why does it matter that they could send 45 tons up there? Why does that extra weight allowance make all the difference?
Well, because humans are heavy and not that heavy. Sorry.
Buzz Aldrin, we hope you are not listening.
The equipment required to keep humans alive in space is heavy. And also, the Apollo astronauts had to come back. A large part of that 45 tons was propellant in the service module of the Apollo capsule and the ascent stage of the lunar module. And this is important because the astronauts wanted to come home. It would have saved a lot of mass if you could have just left them there, but I think they would have been annoyed about that. Yeah.
And you've written about this, and you say that actually a lot of these problems that we talk about when we talk about space exploration, space colonization, start melting away once the mass problem is sorted.
Yes.
Do you want to talk more about that?
Yes. Well, what I've discovered or noticed is that for more or less any problem in space travel, in space colonization, in survival in space, there exists a solution which just involves throwing more mass at it. For instance, people talk a lot about the radiation issue in space. It's a favourite topic of people who just don't like the whole idea and want sort of a quick gotcha to get rid of people. But you can just put more mass in the way of the radiation. You can just build a thicker hull on your spacecraft. The reason this isn't done really is because we're quite constrained on how much mass we can launch. But if that constraint is lifted or relieved, or you can get mass from somewhere else, like if you put a base on the surface of the moon, you just pile up rocks, you don't actually have to take the mass with you, then you've solved the radiation problem with extra mass.
Right. So the problem is the lead sheeting at the moment that would be needed to block the radiation.
You don't actually want to use lead.
You don't want to use lead? Well, so my lead trousers are not going to be any help.
Actually, your thatched roof is actually a pretty good radiation shield.
Oh,
Really? Tell us more.
The type of radiation that comes from space, it's very sort of high energy atomic nuclei. And when they come in and they hit your shield, they can form these nuclear reactions and generate extra radiation. Like you may have seen these particle tracks inside the LHC where there's like all stuff flying everywhere.
Yeah.
Basically that, but it tends to be, because it's got momentum, it's all going in one direction like a shotgun blast. So that tends to happen with the heavy elements like lead. You don't want that in your shield. But it doesn't tend to happen with hydrogen. So you have organic matter with lots of hydrogen atoms in it. They kind of ping off kinetically and it causes the radiation to lose energy instead of creating these secondary showers. So what you want for radiation shielding something fairly thick with a lot of sort of low atomic number things, especially hydrogen in them. And that actually fits the bill.
I think we made an error, Callum. We have only a thatched roof, whereas in fact every side of the space station should be thatched.
Yeah, no, exactly.
That would be optimal.
Actually, this explains why I'm getting tumours on my feet, because the flagstones are clearly sparking off other nuclear reactions. The king would be delighted though that his favourite traditional craftsman will find new work as high performance space material engineers.
Well, the hedge fiddlers will have a role in the space economy.
Exactly. The research will be needed. Which style of hedge laying will actually be most efficient?
I'm not sure. I think this is beyond my expertise. I'm not big on hedges.
Well, and that's the next guest coming.
And as you say, Peter, we went to the moon in 1969, which is more than 50 years ago. So why should people be excited about space travel here in 2024?
Because we're going back to the moon. Well, humanity is. The United States is going back. They're aiming for 2026. It probably will slip. China is going to aim to do it by the end of the decade. And because SpaceX has revolutionized the launch industry, they're putting a lot more mass into orbit than anybody previously. Prior to SpaceX, the most mass that the United States had put into orbit in a single 12-month period was between December 1968 and November 1969. That was Apollo 8 till Apollo 12, when they launched 5 Saturn V rockets in a 12-month period, which is about the equivalent of 700 tons or so to low Earth orbit. SpaceX are in the ballpark of about 2,000 a year now.
And as you say, Peter, we've made fantastic progress over the past few years in reducing the cost of sending mass into space. But people listening to this podcast will wonder, why does it matter to me? How does it change my life?
You're all walking around with a GPS device in your pockets. It can talk to a satellite at tens of thousands of kilometers into space and get your exact position on the Earth. We have weather satellites giving us accurate weather information. We have ones monitoring the progress of climate change, which we need to know about. We have communication satellites, including Starlink, which now means that you can have high-speed internet in the middle of the ocean. So it's already affecting our lives in several ways.
Although our weather forecasting doesn't seem like it's got any better.
I don't know. Before satellites, I think it was even worse.
Oh, well, you just needed old Bob whose bones would ache or something.
But let's talk about the future economic dividends as well. And for context, McKinsey, the consultancy firm, said in 2010 that the space economy was worth, at that point, $280 billion. In 2023, last year, that figure was $447 billion, substantially more. And they also forecast that come 2030, the space economy will be worth $1 trillion, which is very exciting. But can you talk us through how we're going to get there? How does that relate to putting more mass in space?
What's actually going up in these rockets, and what are people actually...
How are we making so much money from this?
And how can I make some?
One of the new latest things is satellite constellations. I mentioned Starlink. That is the big sort of one.
And there's a British version as well, isn't there?
Sort of.
Oh, God. There's always a caveat, isn't there? There's always a caveat.
OneWeb is owned part by our government because it kind of went bust and we sort of picked it up.
So really high quality then.
Yeah. And it's based in the United States. So they manufacture the satellites there. And because of a piece of legislation called ITAR, which stands for International Trafficking Arms Regulations, I don't recall exactly, something like that. And because of this legislation, UK citizens are not really allowed to sort of get involved.
Right, so it's part owned by the government. No British citizens are allowed to work on it, and it's based in the US.
Yes.
Gosh.
So we don't manufacture.
Sounds like a typical.
We've got work to do.
Yeah, exactly. Sounds predictably government led.
Yes, there's also the possibilities of manufacturing things in space because you get long-term weightlessness in space, and that's something you just cannot get on Earth for long periods of time. You can go up in a plane, it sort of drops.
The vomit comment.
The vomit comment, yes. But that's not really good for any long-term processes. And if you have a process which works better in microgravity, you can do that in orbit. And there's a company called Varda Space, which has recently recovered a capsule they sent up to manufacture some pharmaceuticals. So there's some crystals which grow in much more pure form in weightlessness. And this was part of the process of manufacturing this pharmaceutical.
So these are drugs, right? Yeah. That you can produce them and they will form far purer medicines that will be more efficacious.
Yes. Something else you can do with this is fiber optic cables. So fiber optics are just glass, very long, thin glass fibers. You send light signals down them to transmit information. This is how most of your broadband works. And imperfections in the glass cause the signal to lose energy over time. It has to be reboosted. If you can make these very pure fiber optics in microgravity, then you don't need as many boosters, and this saves a lot of money. So this is a way that weightlessness can be used to manufacture something with a lot of economic return.
Right. Okay. So the lack of gravity makes the product better. You're unlocking a whole higher grade of product.
And like you say, it's becoming so much cheaper to get gear into space that we can actually start moving manufacturing equipment up there and get these cheap drugs and cheap fiber optic cables.
And are there any other opportunities?
Yes, I mean, there's some other long term. We want to move other industries into space as well, because in space, pollution doesn't really matter. If you're in the right orbit, you've got access to endless amounts of solar energy. Some of this energy can be beamed back down. There is a proposal that's been kicking around for about 50 years for space-based solar power. So you put some solar cells in a high geostationary orbit. You beam the power back to Earth as microwaves, and this sort of bypasses the clouds. And also, because they're in a high orbit, they don't go behind the Earth very often at all.
Does that mean I could press a button, stick a cup out, and the beams of energy would heat up my
Tea's
kettle?
ready.
Yeah, exactly.
They're not that intense, fortunately, because that would be bad if like birds flew through them. You need to have like a grid of wires in a field.
Right. Okay. Okay. Well,
The advantage is it doesn't have the intermittency of solar. Now, the economics of this have been questioned, but the UK government has invested some money, about £4 million into this, split up among a bunch of research groups to look at, say, making the solar panels last longer in the space radiation environment, because obviously having to replace them more often increases costs. So they're still doing research on this, but there is some interest from the UK government. Another industry is potentially computing, especially for things like AI. We use a lot of computing power. Recently, in fact, the amount of energy we put into computers, and mostly in data centers, exceeded the amount we put into civil aviation. So we could move this up into space. There's some technical complications, but there you've got as much energy as you like. You can cool off by, if you have massive radiators dumping your heat into the cosmic microwave background.
Right, because that's also the problem, isn't it? That actually we're using a vast amount of power, not just to run the computers, but to keep them cool, isn't it?
Yes.
So actually what? So it's now space is becoming hot and smoggy.
I don't think we're going to raise the temperature of the cosmic microwave background with our waste heat. We're not that powerful a civilization yet.
Well, the Edwardians didn't think that they would change the world, and yet it happened. Can you imagine a Greta Thunberg of the solar system trying to stop more solar heating?
Bring it back to Earth. Brilliant idea.
And before we move on, Tom, I can see you're positively bouncing in your seat with a question that you want to ask.
Well, Peter, you are in the King Charles III space station right now, so you know that two men have cracked the problem of creating wooden satellites. Has anyone else managed that?
Yes, actually, as with so many things, the Chinese got there first.
We would never contract a foreign company.
There has been a type of Chinese satellite which had a re-entry capsule, which used, I think, oak as the heat shield. Now, surviving 3,000 degree re-entry heat, you wouldn't think oak's a good substance, but what happens is it chars in the intense heat and then it flakes off, so it ablates, and this carries away the heat with it and it stops the capsule overheating. So you can actually partly build a spacecraft out of wood.
Have you have they tried dipping it in water first? Because that's always the problem when I try and light a fire, that actually the wood just starts steaming rather than actually burning.
I think at the re-entry temperatures, I don't think you need to worry about it getting started.
No fire lighter needed.
Well, Peter, this is all very exciting, and it seems pretty clear that there'll be huge benefits to expansion into space over the next 5 to 10 years. But let's talk about it over a longer time span. How would you like to see human space exploration progress over the next 50 years?
Over the next 50 years, I think we'll see humans on Mars, probably permanently. There'll be a moon base. It's less likely to be a permanent colony. It's more likely to be something a bit like an oil platform or something, where you just go to work for a little while. Because the moon's actually a much harsher environment than Mars. I would also expect to see space stations in Earth orbit, and they will be larger than the ones we have at the moment, substantially larger. In fact, I think that the International Space Station is about 100 meters along the big truss. And when you look at it in the sky, because you can see it from the ground, it's just a big bright dot sort of gliding overhead. And when you see it, it's about 500 kilometers away, depending on the angle. At that distance, you can't make out any detail on something 100 meters across, but it's not that far off where you can. So most of the light you see from the space station comes from the solar panels. If the space station was, say, 200 meters wide instead of 100, you'd sort of see them separate as sort of two kind of like a sort of peanut shape. And we're going to be building things even bigger than that. So I think in the sky in 50 years, you'll see actual objects of human construction that you'll be able to resolve with your naked eye. And
these space stations would be where we are doing things like the pharmaceutical manufacture that we talked about earlier.
In part, yes. Well, some people would just live there because it's a nice place to live, and we can make it a nice place to live. They will also be used as jumping off points for further exploration and travel. And I see them, a lot of stations as well, further out in an orbit around the moon or in the Earth-Moon system. And there will be some on what are called cycle orbits, which is an orbit that kind of pings back and forth between Earth and Mars every 26 months. The idea being that when you go to Mars, normally you have to accelerate all your payload up to the transfer orbit velocity and then decelerate at the end. With the cycler, it's like a space station going around. You meet up with the space station as it passes Earth. You live on the space station for 5 months while you go to Mars. And then you depart the space station to Mars, and the station keeps going round and round.
So it's like the circle line.
Exactly, yes. The circle line in space.
So that's 50 years. What about 500 years from now?
500 years from now, if you look into the sky above Earth, I expect to see something called an orbital ring. This is a fixed ring around the Earth. It's not very thick, but it will go all the way around the Earth, so it'll be a big bright line in the sky. And it'll be tethered to the Earth at various points. And you'll be able to ride vehicles up those tethers and just go into space. The cost of going up to one of these is going to be mostly the cost of the electricity of running the transport up the tether.
Peter, you say that Mars will be colonized by this point. What will it look like? Will there be cities? Will people live there permanently? And what will they be doing with their lives?
I think it'll probably be colonized. There are potential scenarios where it wouldn't be, notably if humans can't reproduce in Martian gravity. This has been raised as sort of like you can't go to Mars because of this, but
I mean, humans, can procreate on waterbeds. So how's that different from Mars?
How do you know?
The issue is how the fetus and child develop. There's no evidence there's any problem to be had, and if you think about it, pregnant women, they move around, they lie down, the fetus does like tumbles and things, and it comes out fine.
Didn't they test these on jellyfish though, and the jellyfish were then really upset when they came back down to Earth?
I don't recall this.
I read somewhere that they'd raised jellyfish in space, and the jellyfish had an absolute great time because you were sort of 4 generations in, and they were very happy, pinging around wherever they wanted to go. And then when they came back down, then they were brought back down to Earth and found it frankly oppressive.
Well, you might do, but that's microgravity.
Right.
So microgravity is pretty bad for human health. You don't want to even try living there. The question is what happens between 0 and 1 gravity. We don't actually have much data at all about that. It's just the guys who walked on the moon, and they were there on the surface for like 2 days maximum.
Not interested in procreating.
Yeah, we don't know what happened inside those lunar modules. And, in the 1960s, you definitely wouldn't sort of...
Don't ask, don't tell.
But I'm not... Don't wish if any living Apollo astronauts, by any chance of listening to this, I don't mean to make any insinuations. It was just a joke. Please don't punch me, Buzz Aldrin. But, yeah, so... Assuming that humans can procreate normally on Mars, and there's a good chance we can, yes, I think the planet will be colonized within 50 years.
The thing that I'm most interested about this Mars colony is what will the buildings look like? Will they be tastefully designed, or will they be more brutalist?
Red brick townhouses.
The red brick is probably going to be on the menu because of the nature of the surface. The main thing is you've got to have a very thick roof. Because again, this is the radiation problem. Unfortunately, I don't think thatch is going to cut it.
No, they wouldn't work with red brick houses aneway.
No, exactly. It's a high performance material only suited for certain spheres.
Because there's more radiation on the surface of Mars than there is on Earth, and it's in the we don't know for certain what will happen, but it's in the sort of the area of a bit of concern. Now, the main thing that protects us from radiation on Earth, a lot of people think it's a magnetic field. That does a little bit, but mostly it's the atmosphere. So we have 1,000 grams of shielding per square centimetre above our heads, directly upwards.
And that's just oxygen, nitrogen, whatever.
So that's when you see the aurora, you get these. That's basically the Earth's radiation shield in action.
Right, so we were just under a ferocious barrage.
Mm-hmm. And it would be unpleasant if that actually hit you without any radiation shielding.
Yeah, purple's not really my colour.
But so on Mars, there's very little atmosphere. There is some, though, and you can get some protection from it. And it's angle dependent because obviously the radiation is coming straight down. It doesn't have to go through much atmosphere. But if it's coming in a very shallow angle, it has to travel through a lot more. So you think about how the sun is sort of gentler and redder when it's low in the horizon. It's a different physical effect, but the same idea. There's more mass in the way. So what you've got to shield on Mars is your roof. You've got to get these cosmic rays coming down. You've got to get rid of them. and you're probably okay to have a bit of sort of open sides. Well, not open to the atmosphere, but sort of not heavily shielding. You have windows and things. So you're not going to be fully underground, but you are going to have a heavy shield on your roof.
Well, I mean, I think a lot of listeners will be familiar with what living in a semi-basement in a small flat in London feels like. So actually, it'll be home away from home.
Yes.
But more ambitiously, Peter, some people think that with regard Mars, we can go further than having a thick roof. We can terraform it and create an atmosphere that does, in fact, shield us from radiation.
Yes, a lot of people think terraforming. They think that we're going to turn into Scotland. It's just going to be like Earth but colder. Some nice conifers. You know,
Golf courses.
Yeah, obviously you need golf courses.
Bigger mountains.
Yeah, but that's really, if that's possible, that's very far off. But what you can do is, when you thicken the atmosphere of Mars, you don't need to thicken it that much to make a significant difference. You get it up to about 10 times its current thickness. You can have liquid water on the surface. You don't need a spacesuit outside anymore. You can just have an oxygen mask. Because you get above what's called the Armstrong limit.
The Armstrong limit.
Nothing to do with that Armstrong. It's
right.
It's the pressure below which you cannot use an oxygen mask alone. You need a full pressure suit.
Right. So,
but we can get it. Mars is below that limit. We can get it above that limit.
That's the point where you stop popping. Is it where
you don't pop in space?
You don't pop in space.
It's just that the external pressure on your lungs is you can't sort of breathe.
Right. Okay. So you're squeezing yourself in order to be able to suck in.
Yeah. It's and you also get the problem that the fluids in your lungs will evaporate at this pressure.
Right.
So you will get Mars above that pressure, but when you do, like the dust storms will calm down. You'll get substantially more radiation protection.
So it'd be better than Scotland.
Mars is green and pleasant land. And these early settlers of Mars, Peter, what kind of people will they be?
They'll be kind of nutters. I think a lot of them will have the kind of founder personality. Because if someone founds a company, they put themselves through a lot of discomfort and risk for the opportunity to build something, which could be brilliant. And if you go to Mars in the sort of early groups, then you'll be encountering a huge amount of risk and discomfort, but you'll have the opportunity potentially to build an entire civilization, not just a company.
Peter, I can see a certain glint in your eye. How far down that nutter scale would you put yourself? What sort of amenities or standard of living would there have to be before you jetted off?
Well, because I'm older now with a family, I think I would have to have a very high standard. If this had been kicking off when I was 20, I would have been straight there. I wouldn't have cared. But now I have responsibilities on this planet, which I enjoy, are absolutely fine, but it does really make it unlikely I'll be going to Mars myself.
Tom, what about you? Do you think would you put yourself as a nutter?
I'd be tempted.
I have to say, I'd be tempted. I would be tempted as well, yeah.
There's certainly a dearth of podcasters on Mars at the moment.
Exactly. An untapped market in the otherwise oversaturated Terran podcast sphere.
Well, it brings to mind the young men who would leave British soil in the 18th or 19th centuries to, through taking great risk, seek their fortune abroad.
Yeah, I think that there's definitely an analogy there. Although obviously, in the case of Mars, there's nobody living there. So there's no sort of moral issue with sort of going to somebody else's land and taking their stuff and doing horrible things.
No terrible human cost.
How do you like, Tom, the idea of having a town named after you, or even a continent? We will go to a break, but join us after an ad to hear about how Britain could get on board this gravy train.
Our friends over at Scran & Sons have kindly sent us over their new Food Facts 3000. Just imagine, you are 3 months into your shift on the British Antarctic Territory oil rig and you are craving your mother's cooking. Worry no longer. With the new model, you can now get her to simply fax it over to you via a satellite in sun-synchronous orbit.
In fact, your mother, Tom, has been slaving away in the kitchen all morning so that we could do a live demo. The green light is flashing. Shall we receive our leek and potato pie?
It will be just like home.
shouldn't sound like that. Where's the clock? Where's the clock?
It's going everywhere.
It's going to get the electronics. Listeners, I fear that there has been a breakdown in communication and we have been sent not a pie, but a soup.
Nonetheless, we endorse the food facts wholeheartedly, and we are sure that the pastry issues will be patched soon.
Welcome back, listeners, to our conversation with Peter Hague. We will be talking in the second half of the podcast about Britain's role in the new space economy. Peter, you wrote at the end of last year about a prediction you made several years ago. And this was around the time that Elon Musk first announced the project that would become Starship. And you said at that point that SpaceX would send a human to Mars before the UK government could get a high-speed train to Manchester. How has that prediction aged?
Pretty well, thanks to the combined efforts of Elon Musk and Rishi Sunak.
Alas, you win some, you lose some. But whilst our high-speed rail projects are moribund, the same is not quite so true of our space sector, is it?
No, we have a fairly good commercial space sector. We are the second biggest destination for private investment in space after the United States. Although
more than China and Russia.
I don't think there's much private investment in space programs in those countries.
Yes, I retract my question.
Yeah, we have tended to specialise in sort of instruments for other people's satellites, and also in making our own small satellites. That's satellites in the less than 500 kilogram class.
And perhaps you could explain to listeners where exactly we are in the ecosystem of space agencies.
Well, we have the UK Space Agency. It's not particularly well funded. As I said, we're a fairly big commercial space player, but in comparison, our public space sector is pretty small. According to PwC, the revenue of the UK space sector is over 17 billion, but it's only about £500 million funding for the UK Space Agency.
You're saying, though, here that actually our commercial space industry is in rude health almost despite the lack of government investment. And actually, by putting in more investment, we could unlock significant gains here.
That seems reasonable, yes. We are participating in the Artemis program. This is NASA's program to put humans back on the moon. We are making some components for their gateway station. They'll put this very small space station in orbit of the moon as part of the mission, and there's going to be some UK-built components on that. We're also going to be putting a communication satellite around the moon, and we already have the Goonhilly station in Cornwall, which was used to communicate with Artemis 1, and will be used to communicate with this lunar relay satellite that we're building in this country.
This sounds slightly characteristic of us, though, doesn't it? That we're good at doing parts and we can spit out nice little bits and bobs, but actually we struggle to pull it all together into a coherent program.
Well, more to the point, we hold an ignominious record, don't we?
Yes, we're the only country to develop a space launch capability and then abandon it.
Right. So actually, we actually have the distinction of being the only country that could say we're going to reclaim our spacefaring heritage.
Take back control.
Well, possibly, but I'm going to be a bit controversial here. And this rocket we launched called Black Arrow, it wasn't a very good rocket.
All the Black Arrow fans out there, Peter, are in uproar.
It couldn't send a lot to orbit, and the reason they cancelled it was because it had so little payload, and especially in the 70s when electronics were big and bulky, they couldn't find much use for it. There's not enough missions for it to do to keep the thing launching. The real missed opportunity was something called Blue Streak about a decade earlier. If you've ever been to the National Space Centre in Leicester, there's the big silver rocket that's hanging up in the main bit. That's Blue Streak. This was a much larger, more efficient rocket than Black Arrow. If you gave it an upper stage, and there was a proposal that a American Centaur upper stage could have been manufactured under license in the UK and put on top of this, it would have allowed us to pursue some solar system exploration with probes in the 1960s.
But your point is that actually our time out of the sun is over, and actually now is the time to reopen and restart this capability, isn't it?
Yes, you are spearheading a campaign, aren't you? Let's hear about it.
I've been watching Starship launches for some time, and I realised that this is the future. This is SpaceX have developed or are developing a fully reusable rocket.
And Starship, to remind listeners, is the flagship of the SpaceX fleet, and it's totally enormous and it's going to change everything.
Yes, it's roughly in terms of what it can throw into space and its size, it's roughly equivalent to the Saturn V moon rocket, but it's unlike the Saturn V, it is reusable, and it's even more reusable than the Falcon rocket. With Starship, the booster comes back in a similar way to Falcon 9, although they will have a very strange mechanism to catch it on the launch tower that it launched from.
These are the chopsticks.
The chopsticks.
Right. And what are those?
There's a big launch tower that's next to the rocket when it launches. It's got two big sort of metal arms on it. And these are out of the way when it launches. When it's away, they get into position and the booster flies back. It aims between these two massive metal arms and they just gently close in, give it a little hug, and they catch this gigantic booster, which is about the size of the first two stages of the Saturn V put together. It's enormous. Well, I started a petition to get the UK government to build a spaceport that is capable of launching SpaceX Starship. At the moment, we have a couple of spaceports. We have one in Shetland, one in northern Scotland, and a horizontal spaceport in Cornwall.
What makes a horizontal one different? I imagine it's pretty universal that space is up.
Yes, but there's not many places you can launch in the UK where you're not overflying population areas, which you don't want to do. So what Spaceport Cornwall did was they hosted Virgin Orbit, who have a rocket hanging from a plane. So it flew it into the Atlantic and tried to launch the rocket from there. Unfortunately, that failed.
Ah, right.
So they attempted to bring back launch, but it didn't work out and Virgin Orbit went bankrupt. What I'm suggesting is that SpaceX is not going anywhere and they are developing what will be the best launch system this decade. And we should see if we can get that launching from this country.
And that would entail doing something very interesting, which is building not only a normal spaceport, but something so large that we could call it a super spaceport. Tell us about the engineering challenges that a super spaceport involves.
For a start, you've got to make it fairly distant from population centres because there's an outside chance that the rocket will explode. And it doesn't take a large portion of the fuel inside the rocket combusting to make a very big explosion. And also when you go downrange of the rocket, it produces large sonic booms. And if it explodes in the sky, debris can rain down. So you tend to want to launch it over the ocean. We'd have to replicate all the stuff they have at their main launch site in Boca Chica in Texas. So we'd have to build launch towers. We'd have to build these grabber arms, which grab onto the lower stage when it comes back to the launch site.
And when you first wrote about this campaign, Peter, the Declanists were roused from their wattle and daub huts, weren't they?
Lifted their head from the muck that they'd buried their noses in.
And they sprang out and they said, aren't we in the wrong latitude for having a super spaceport?
Not necessarily. One of these things people pick up about space and orbits is that it's easier to launch from the equator because you've got this kick from the Earth's rotation, which is larger there. But that's only really helpful if you're launching into an equatorial orbit, where you're going around in the same direction as the Earth rotates at low inclination. But you can do polar orbits, where you're at a very high inclination, you're going over the poles, and in this case, you don't really want the Earth's rotation involved because it's going in the wrong direction.
And these are good orbits, as orbits go.
They're widely used for spy satellites, for Earth observation, anything where you want to cover the entire Earth.
So suited to us as a nation of curtain twitchers.
Yes. And there are also a subset of polar orbits called sun-synchronous orbits. And these are useful for various things. You can synchronize them such that every time you fly over a part of the Earth, you see it lit from the exact same angle by the sun, which is useful for comparing changes over time. And also, there's a subset of sun-synchronous orbits which keep you aligned with the direction of the Earth's movement. And this is helpful for interplanetary trajectories. You can actually get to Mars from some sun-synchronous orbits that you could launch from the UK.
So that's where we'll rename our Shetland base St Pancras.
And this latitude gives us an opportunity, doesn't it? I'm just going to connect the dots here. Because Boca Chica, I think someone from SpaceX said in court once, has cost SpaceX about $3 billion.
Mm-hmm.
The space economy is going to be worth $1 trillion. These orbits you describe together comprise 1/3 of the space economy. So as you have argued, this spaceport, in fact, represents a pretty big economic opportunity for whoever does it first.
Yes, I think so. And there's a race on because recently Japan signed an agreement with the US. It was mostly about defense, but it had parts about space. They were contributing a pressurized rover built by Toyota to operate on the surface of the moon. And one of the things they got in return for this was that there was a new agreement for US commercial launch from Japanese territory.
Right. So the people are wising up that getting your slice of this pie is increasingly important.
Yes, I would assume they're thinking of Starship. And also SpaceX themselves have repeatedly said that they want to look into offshore launch platforms. I mean, this would get around export regulations, I guess, if it was done in international waters. And I think one of the possibly good sites to launch from in the UK is not actually the UK itself, but in the North Sea.
Well, that's interesting because one of the other projects of this podcast is raising Dogger Bank.
Yeah, that would be great.
Dogger Bank, an ideal location for rockets.
Yes, because you can fly north from there and you're not going to overfly any land.
Duncan's going to love this. Absolutely wonderful. And you've argued that the UK government should make this happen by striking a deal with SpaceX or Blue Origin, coaxing them over here, saying, we will pay the £1 billion or whatever it might be to open this spaceport. You can operate it.
Yes, well, they've already done that in the case of Virgin Orbit, and they are currently doing something similar with a company called Rocket Factory Augsburg from Germany. They'll be launching a vertical rocket, it's a very small rocket, but they'll be launching that from Saxaford. So there's already an economic model for how this can be done. The only question is applying it to a much larger spaceport and a larger vehicle. And part of the way to get it done, I think, is to create a big project which will demand a lot of launches from it. And so you can show SpaceX and the US government, who would have to be involved as well for arms control reasons, we can show them that if they do this, it'll be worth their while because there'll be a lot of use of it. And I think the big project that we should use to drive this would be the construction of a large space station in low Earth orbit.
A sister space station for the one in which we are currently sitting.
A younger sister.
The International Space Station can host about 6 people, and you send 3 or 4 people up at a time, and that determines in part its size. If you were to load people on a Starship with the same kind of density that they're loaded onto a Soyuz capsule or a Dragon capsule, you could fit maybe 200, 300 people on it. So you would have to have a much larger scale space station, and there's not really many people thinking in these terms at the moment. If you look at the funded proposals for commercial space stations, they're a little bit bigger than the ISS in some cases, but they're not much bigger. We're still talking a dozen people tops. So the design that I'm sort of using as a baseline to work from is something called Kalpana 2, which was proposed by a guy who works at NASA called Al Globus. And it's a drum over 100 meters in diameter, which rotates at 4 RPM, and this provides gravity on the interior surface.
Right, because it's rotating around and you're sort of forced out against the outsides.
Yeah, just like a fairground ride. So because it's got gravity, you would be able to just live here. And you would be able to live and work there. So what I envisage this enabling is, at the moment, if you want to do a space startup, you've got to get over the barrier of putting something into space, which is expensive and it takes time. If you lived in space when you started your space startup, you could... It
wouldn't even be a startup. It wouldn't be a space startup. It would just be your startup,
yes,
wouldn't it?
And you could build stuff and essentially push it out of the window. So it would be a place for adults, at least, to live and work. And by making it in large scale, this means you can transport hundreds of people to it at once. And if you fit that many people in a Starship, they get to split the cost between them. So if a Starship may cost $10 million to launch, if you have like 200 people on board, you're paying $50,000. And so this might be what you'd pay to go to university on Earth. You would say, well, I don't want to go to university. I want to go into space and try and do something in space instead.
There are just as many opportunities for bad decision making up in space as there are at university.
Yes.
I like the idea about 200 because it means it's roughly about the same size as a double-decker bus. So we could give it a number. We could it could be, you know, it's like having the 14 turn up on your doorstep, packed full of earnest young men and women.
And it's bright red.
Yeah, exactly.
And all this activity up there in this British space station, Peter, amounts to huge economic benefits for the rest of us. But your case for the spaceport and for the space station is not purely economic, is it? You say it's a glorious endeavour.
Yes. I mean, sometimes NASA likes to explain what their worth is as a space agency in terms of the consumer products that have come out of research done initially in the space program. So things like cordless power tools. But if you go back to the first moon landing, they nearly crashed. There was the landing area they pointed to was full of boulders, and Neil Armstrong had to take manual control of the lunar module. They could have aborted, gone back to the command module, but he took control, steered them to a safe landing spot, and they landed successfully at great risk. I don't think he did it for cordless power tools. There are higher purposes for people and for civilizations. So I think Britain needs to capture a bit of that spirit. If you read what the UK Space Agency sort of says about itself and its role, it's always saying, oh, benefits for Earth and it's benefits for net zero, which is all fine, but we need to sort of say that space is an end in itself. It's not just about helping Earth. It's about going out there and building a new civilization.
Well, and actually, right, a lot of these benefits are impossible to even conceive of now, right? That, for example, the oil that was just discovered in the British Antarctica territory, it's only the British Antarctica territory because we were sending explorers for the glory of going to Antarctica and seeing just if they could, right? And actually, you're saying that the benefits of space are so far in the future and are so vast that we can't even comprehend them.
Yes, one of the main benefits of the Apollo program was that they contracted with a company called Fairchild Semiconductor to build the guidance computer for Apollo. And this company, it had the Apollo contract. It also had a contract for the Minuteman nuclear missile, which needed compact electronics as well. And it pioneered integrated circuits, as in computer chips, taking multiple transistors on a single piece of silicon. And it did well off these contracts, but when these contracts dried up, the business failed fairly quickly. It wasn't viable without this government propping it up. But the founders of Intel and AMD worked at this company. So when the thing fell apart and the capital was reallocated, you've got these two companies making chips. And it was Gordon Moore of Intel, while at Fairchild Semiconductor, coined his law of this doubling transistors every 18 months.
Moore's law,
which initially wasn't so much a prediction as a business plan. And this is what he went into Intel saying. He founded Intel saying, we're going to make this, we're going to have this target to make a memory chip which is denser than anything by a factor of 2 in this time scale. And they did that, and they kept doing that, and it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. But nobody who paid for Apollo thought of this. Everyone thought it was going to have various benefits about showing off to the world and advancing rocket technology. They didn't see the computer revolution coming at all. And it's been the main economic benefit of the Apollo program. But even beyond that, we can't just sort of think in terms of there's going to be some monetary benefit further down the line. There are more important things. We're kind of trapped in this country by sort of what they call treasury brain, and this constant idea that the only rational way to spend money in society is by looking at return on investment. And this kind of it allows government ministers and bureaucrats to play act as venture capitalists, essentially, and take on the sort of serious veneer of businessmen. which is a bit ridiculous. Their job is to spend money according to the values of the country. We don't want people to become bankrupt from healthcare, so we fund the NHS. We want to defend democracy, so we pay to send weapons to Ukraine. None of these things are immediately, they're not done for profit. So space shouldn't be done for profit either. It should be done because it is a thing that great nations do, and we should consider ourselves a great nation.
And we can hope perhaps that in our lifetime, the Union flag might be planted in the Martian dust.
Oh, I think it will, definitely. But I don't think it'll go alone. I think we still will collaborate with other nations.
Well, I'm sure the cricket pitch will fit alongside the German handball court and the French
French pétanque.
Yeah, French pétanque lane. Well, I think on that note, shall we wrap up? Peter, if people want to read more of your research, and maybe even if they've been convinced, sign your petition, where can they find you?
Planetocracy.substack.com. I'm also active on Twitter, /X, as Peter R. Hague. My middle name is Richard. There is another Peter Hague on there who doesn't like getting tagged. So make sure it's me. I'm the one with the AI-modified black and white avatar.
Unless you didn't like what you heard, in which case his middle name is not Richard.
Go to the other Peter
Go
Hague.
to the other Peter Hague. Following the untimely announcement of an election and the dissolution of Parliament, Peter's petition was withdrawn. But listeners will be delighted to hear that it will return after the 4th of July, and you are strongly encouraged to visit his website and sign up.
Peter is about to step aboard his shuttle back to Earth. Callum and I are going back to the cleanup of the King Charles.
It's the mop and bucket for me.
Peter, thanks for coming aboard.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll speak to you soon. Goodbye.